Millionaire went for a coffee and broke into a cold sweat when he saw the waitress's ring. As it was the same ring he had given to Ethan Collins, was the embodiment of success. At 50 years old, he commanded a fortune most could only dream of attaining. As the owner of a chain of technology companies, he resided in a luxurious penthouse in Manhattan and often graced magazine covers as one of the most influential men in the United States. Yet his personal life was a void. The silent halls of his penthouse and the formal exchanges in boardroom meetings were the only witnesses to his loneliness. One morning, weary of the glamorous but cold routine that had come to define his life, Ethan decided to venture out alone and explore the streets of Boston, the city where he had spent his youth. He typically avoided thinking about that time, yet an inexplicable nostalgia drew him back. Strolling through the historic streets, he stumbled upon the Maple Brew, a quaint corner cafe with an exposed brick facade and the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Its sign promised homemade coffee and good conversation, perhaps unknowingly, exactly what Ethan needed. Before continuing, make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Upon entering, a sense of peace enveloped him. There was something timeless about the cafe, the blend of the rich coffee aroma with the sound of cheerful laughter and relaxed conversations. The simplicity of the place felt like a warm embrace. He chose a table by the window where he could watch the pedestrians passing by. For a fleeting moment, Ethan felt like just another person, blending into the crowd. He had barely begun to lose himself in thought when a soft, warm voice interrupted his quiet contemplation. "Good morning, what can I get you today?" asked a young waitress with an earnest smile and unassuming gestures that sharply contrasted with the apathy of the world Ethan was accustomed to. He looked up and saw her, brown hair pinned into a messy bun, a simple apron stained with coffee, and bright eyes that seemed to conceal untold stories. She introduced herself as Grace, holding a small notepad in her hands. Ethan hesitated briefly before ordering a plain black coffee, something he rarely drank. He usually opted for exotic blends imported from far-flung corners of the world, but in that moment, simplicity felt right. Grace jotted down his order quickly and walked away with the same warmth she had brought to his table. When she returned with his coffee, she casually remarked on how lost he seemed. "First time here?" she asked with an easygoing tone. Ethan chuckled awkwardly, admitting it was, though he revealed little else. There was something about her that fascinated him, not in a romantic way, but in a manner he couldn't quite articulate. It was as if she carried something familiar, something he couldn't place. As he lifted the cup to take his first sip, his gaze fell, almost accidentally, on Grace's hand as she picked up a napkin from the table. That's when he saw it. A simple yet unmistakable ring, adorned with a delicate blue stone surrounded by intricate details. The world seemed to stand still. Ethan recognized it instantly. It was the very same ring he had bought for Emily Turner more than 2 decades ago. His heart raced, as though his carefully crafted tranquility had been shattered, plunging him into a past he had long buried. Grace noticed his fixed gaze and asked if everything was okay. Ethan tried to mask his turmoil, but his mind was racing. That ring, how was it here? How did she have it? Was it an impossible coincidence or a fragment of his past returning to haunt him? The coffee seemed to lose its flavor in Ethan's mouth. He held the cup mechanically, while his mind raced a mile a minute. Every detail of that ring came flooding back to him. The day he bought it, the hopes he carried when he placed it in Emily's hands, and the crushing pain of the moment everything fell apart. He needed to know how the ring had ended up on Grace's finger, but any rash action might alarm her or raise suspicions. Taking a deep breath, Ethan decided to start a conversation. "That's a beautiful ring," he commented casually, forcing a light tone. Grace, oblivious to the intensity behind his words, looked at him with a smile. "Oh, thank you. It's really special to me. My mom gave it to me when I turned 18. She said it had an important story, but she never really explained it," Ethan's heart leapt. Her mother. The pieces began to fall into place in his mind. It was almost impossible to ignore the weight of that information. He tried to continue the conversation without revealing his growing anxiety. "Your mom sounds like an amazing person. Does she live around here?" he asked, striving to sound casual. Grace nodded. "Yes, she does. We're from Boston. She's always been very reserved, you know? She doesn't talk much about the past. But she's been such an inspiration to me." Every word Grace spoke seemed to draw Ethan closer to a truth he both feared and longed for. He knew he needed to find out more, but he had to tread carefully. Still, a wave of memories hit him hard. The image of Emily, the sound of her laughter, the way her eyes sparkled when they talked about their future together. Now, this young woman before him, with those same vibrant eyes and the same ring, felt like a ghost from a lost time. "And you? What brought you to this cafe?" Grace asked, pulling him out of his thoughts. Ethan, caught off guard, answered with a forced smile. "I guess I was just looking for something different, something simple." Deep down, he knew that answer wasn't just about the coffee. When Grace stepped away to attend to another customer, Ethan was left alone with his thoughts. The coffee grew cold on the table, untouched, as he stared into the memory of the ring, as though he could pull answers from the object itself. The storm of emotions was almost unbearable. He knew this wasn't a coincidence. Couldn't be. But what did it mean? Emily might be alive, perhaps close by, and possibly hiding secrets that could change everything. The quiet of the cafe seemed to amplify the sound of his uneven breathing. The memories surged back with overwhelming force. He saw himself again at 25, offering the ring to Emily on a cold December night. They were sitting on a bench in Boston Common, Christmas lights reflecting off the snow. "This is the start of our forever," he had said, his hands trembling as much from emotion as from the cold. Emily had accepted it with tears in her eyes, promising to love him forever. Yet, only a few months later, their forever had been cut short. The breakup had been abrupt and painful. Ethan remembered the shouting, the unresolved bitterness, and, finally, Emily's departure without leaving an address. He had thrown himself into his work, determined to bury the pain, and had never searched for her. Why was the past now resurfacing? And why through this young woman, whose life seemed so simple and so distant from his own? Grace returned to the table with another smile, breaking the weight of his memories. "Do you need anything else?" she asked lightly. Ethan hesitated but decided he needed to leave and sort through his thoughts. "No, thank you. Just the check, please." Grace nodded and returned with the receipt a few minutes later. He paid, leaving a generous tip, and walked out without looking back, though his mind remained trapped in that cafe. Outside, Boston's cold air seemed to bite at his skin, but it was nothing compared to the chill in his chest. Ethan knew this wasn't the end. He would have to find answers, and that meant discovering where Emily was and how the ring had ended up on Grace's finger. He took a deep breath, looking up at the cloudy sky. For the first time in years, he felt as though fate was moving, bringing something he couldn't control. Ethan spent the rest of the day in suffocating restlessness. He returned to the hotel where he was staying, but the luxurious tranquility of the place felt more stifling than relaxing. He paced back and forth in his suite, battling the thoughts that overwhelmed him. The image of the ring on Grace's finger haunted him, as did her words about her mother. It was inevitable. He had to know more about Emily, and that meant devising a plan to approach Grace without arousing suspicion. By nightfall, Ethan sat with a glass of whiskey in hand, staring at the city lights through the massive glass window. The beauty of Boston at night felt heavy, as if each light was an echo of something he had lost. He remembered how he and Emily used to dream of that view, imagining a future where they'd have a simple home filled with love. Now, he had all the luxury he could want, but no love to fill the emptiness. Determined to act, Ethan picked up the phone and made a few calls. He still had contacts in Boston, people who could help him learn more about Grace and her mother without revealing his intentions directly. It wasn't his usual way of handling things, but the circumstances demanded caution. During the conversation, he confirmed some basic information about Grace Parker and discovered where Emily Turner was currently living. She was residing in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, far from the glitz and glamour Ethan had once imagined they would share together. After hanging up, Ethan felt a mix of anxiety and relief. Knowing Emily was alive and so close shook him more than he wanted to admit. He knew he would have to confront her, but he feared what he might find. Did she still harbor any resentment? Would she have completely forgotten him? And how could he explain his presence in her life after so much time? Ethan glanced at his watch. It was already late, but he knew he wouldn't be able to sleep. He decided that the next morning, he would return to the Maple Brew. He needed to establish a connection with Grace before seeking out Emily. Something told him that the answers were closer than he imagined, but he would need patience and courage to face them. The following morning, Ethan woke early, though not because he had slept well. The night had been a cycle of restless thoughts and brief moments of sleep interrupted by his anxiety. He took a cold shower, dressed in more casual clothes to avoid drawing attention, and set out to walk the streets of Boston until the Maple Brew opened. The cool morning air helped him stay focused, though the weight of the past loomed over him like a shadow. When he entered the cafe, he was greeted by the same welcoming atmosphere as the day before. Grace was at the counter, busy preparing orders, her smile lighting up the space as if the simplicity of her work brought her joy. Ethan chose the same table by the window and waited patiently. He knew he couldn't rush what he was trying to do. Everything needed to appear natural. Grace approached him with her usual warmth. "Good morning. You're back. I guess you liked the coffee yesterday." "Huh," she said with a relaxed tone and a smile. Ethan responded with a light grin. "I liked the coffee and the atmosphere. It's different from the places I usually go to." He made an effort to sound approachable, something he rarely concerned himself with. Grace jotted down his order and returned shortly, bringing not only the coffee but also a slice of carrot cake. "This is on the house. We like to take care of our regulars." Ethan seized the opportunity to strike up a longer conversation. He asked about the cafe, the neighborhood, and gradually the conversation drifted toward Grace. She talked about her work, her plans, and her love for the simplicity of her life. As she spoke, Ethan felt a mix of admiration and melancholy. Grace was full of life and dreams, so much like Emily had been in her youth. Eventually, Ethan found a way to steer the conversation toward her family. "You mentioned yesterday that your mom is a big inspiration for you. She must be an incredible person," he said. Grace smiled, her eyes sparkling. "She is. She did everything on her own for me, worked hard and never stopped supporting me, even when things got tough. She's the strongest person I know." Ethan listened intently, feeling a pang in his chest with each word. He didn't need to hear her name. He knew Emily was the one being described. As Grace was called back to the counter to help another customer, Ethan watched her from a distance. There was something comforting yet devastating about seeing her move with such energy. He felt he was on the verge of uncovering something monumental, but he still didn't know how to take the next step without risking everything. Ethan left the Maple Brew that morning certain he was on the right path, but the weight of uncertainty still lingered. He spent the day distracted, lost in thought. Grace's words echoed in his mind. "She's the strongest person I know." Emily had always been strong, but what could have happened during the years they were apart? How had she faced those challenges alone? And why had she never reached out to him, especially if Grace was her daughter? Determined to take a more direct step, Ethan decided he needed to see Emily before making any further moves. However, he knew a sudden approach could end disastrously. He needed to learn more about her current life to better understand the context she was living in. Without wasting time, he turned once again to his contacts. Within hours, he had detailed information about Emily. She worked as a teacher at a public school in the suburbs of Boston and lived in a modest but well-kept house in a quiet neighborhood. By late afternoon, Ethan decided to drive through the neighborhood where Emily lived. He drove slowly along the tree-lined streets, observing the simple, inviting houses. When he finally found the address, he parked at a safe distance and watched the house. There was nothing remarkable about it, yet it radiated a sense of serenity that seemed to reflect Emily herself. He saw the living room lights turn on, and shortly after, the figure of a woman appeared in the window. It was her. Even from a distance, Ethan recognized the features he had never forgotten. The way she tied her hair, her firm yet calm demeanor. Emily was tidying something near the window, and he noticed the same meticulous care he had always admired in her. Ethan's heart raced, and for a moment, he felt an urge to step out of the car and knock on the door. But he knew it wasn't time yet. As he watched, a young woman entered the room, and Ethan immediately recognized Grace. The two seemed to be chatting animatedly, laughing about something only they understood. It was such a simple scene, yet so full of meaning. Ethan saw the reflection of everything he had lost. A family that should have been his. He felt a lump in his throat, a mix of regret and longing to belong to that story once again. After a few minutes, he decided to leave. He wasn't ready to face them, but that glimpse of Emily and Grace together strengthened his resolve. He knew he would have to be honest and gather the courage to face the consequences of his past and find a way to build something new, even if it was just an explanation. Ethan spent the following days trying to figure out the right approach. He continued visiting the Maple Brew, using each visit as an opportunity to get to know Grace better. The more he talked with her, the more he felt drawn to her personality. She was cheerful, determined, and carried a maturity that seemed beyond her years. Often, he found himself thinking about how much she reminded him of Emily, not just in her mannerisms, but in the inner strength that shone through her words. One particularly busy morning at the cafe, Grace approached Ethan's table with a slightly different demeanor, as if she were hesitating to say something. "Hey, you've been coming here a lot lately. I hope it's not because we've been messing up the coffee," she joked with a smile, though her eyes revealed genuine curiosity. Ethan, trying to maintain his composure, replied in a light-hearted tone. "Actually, it's the opposite. I think I've found the perfect place to escape the hustle and bustle." Grace seemed pleased with his answer, but she lingered, as if weighing her next words. Finally, she spoke. My mom's stopping by later. We're planning something together for a charity event the cafe hosts every year. You should meet her. She's amazing." Ethan felt the ground drop out from under him for a moment. Emily would be here in the same space as him within hours. He fought to control the surge of emotion rising like a tidal wave. "That sounds interesting. What kind of event are you organizing?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. Grace enthusiastically described a community bazaar to raise funds for a local school, mentioning how much her mom loved getting involved in causes that help children. Ethan barely processed the details. His mind was fixed on the idea of seeing Emily again, now with a real opportunity to meet her face to face. When Grace went off to serve other customers, Ethan allowed himself to take a deep breath. He realized that fate was handing him the chance he had been too hesitant to create for himself. It was as if the universe had conspired to make this meeting happen. Yet, he also knew he would have to tread carefully to ensure the moment didn't spiral into disaster. As he waited, Ethan considered every possible scenario. How would Emily react to seeing him? Would she be happy or still harbor wounds that he could never heal? And how could he explain his presence there, his growing connection with Grace, without coming across as intrusive or calculating? The questions were endless, but one thing was clear. Whatever happened, he couldn't back down. Not this time. Time seemed to crawl as Ethan waited for Emily to arrive. He stayed at the same table, trying to appear natural, though his heart raced every time the cafe door swung open. The space, which had once offered him a sense of calm, now felt stifling and overwhelmingly loud. as if every sound magnified his anxiety. He tried to focus on the newspaper he had brought, but the words blurred and danced on the page, illegible against his restlessness. Finally, the door opened again, and Ethan saw her. Emily walked into the cafe with the same quiet grace he remembered, though time had left subtle marks on her face. Her hair, now streaked with gray, was pulled into a simple bun, and she wore a blue wool coat that seemed perfectly tailored to her. There was something both comforting and overwhelming about seeing her after all these years. Grace rushed over to greet her mother, embracing her with a warmth that made Ethan's heart tighten. He couldn't tear his gaze away. Every movement Emily made, every expression on her face, brought back a flood of memories. He felt a mix of joy and pain, as if he were standing before a fragment of his life he had believed was lost forever. Emily, for her part, didn't seem to notice Ethan's presence. She was focused on her conversation with Grace, who gestured animatedly while explaining the details of the charity event. Emily's smile was genuine, but her eyes held a depth Ethan recognized all too well, as though she too was tethered to memories she couldn't let go of. Ethan knew he had to act. He couldn't just sit there watching from afar like a stranger. Yet he felt frozen with fear. What if she rejected him? What if time had built an insurmountable wall between them? He took a deep breath, trying to summon his courage. He decided to wait for a quieter moment, a chance to approach without interrupting the interaction between mother and daughter. After a few minutes, Emily sat down at one of the tables near the counter while Grace returned to work. This was his chance. Ethan stood, his heart racing, and walked slowly toward her. Every step felt amplified, echoing in his mind as if the moment were being recorded in slow motion. When he finally reached the table, Emily looked up, and their eyes met. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Emily's eyes widened slightly, and he saw recognition flash across her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Ethan, his voice hoarse, finally broke the silence. "Emily, it really is you." Emily blinked, as if trying to confirm she wasn't imagining things. The surprise on her face quickly gave way to a mix of emotions Ethan couldn't fully decipher. There was shock, disbelief, and perhaps a hint of sadness. She leaned forward slightly, as if searching for words that eluded her. "Ethan," she finally said, her voice soft, almost a whisper, laced with cautious incredulity. He nodded, trying to steady himself amidst the whirlwind of emotions. "It's me. I can't believe I'm seeing you." His words were heavy with emotion, though he tried to keep them controlled. He didn't want to overwhelm her, but knew this was a moment he couldn't let slip away. Emily glanced around, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. She didn't seem uncomfortable, but it was clear she was experiencing the same avalanche of feelings Ethan was. She adjusted her coat and finally looked at him more closely. How did you find me? What are you doing here?" Her questions held no hostility, only genuine curiosity mixed with apprehension. Ethan slowly pulled out a chair and sat down, keeping a respectful distance. "I didn't know I would find you, Emily. It was a coincidence or maybe fate. I met your daughter, Grace. She works here and I saw the ring." He paused, watching for her reaction. At the mention of the ring, he saw her eyes fill with what seemed like understanding and a touch of sadness. Emily sighed, intertwining her fingers on the table. For a moment, she appeared lost in thought, as though trying to decide what to say. Finally, she spoke, her voice steadier now. "The ring. I never had the courage to let it go. I thought the love it represented still deserved to be remembered, even if our lives took different paths." Her words struck Ethan like a delicate yet profound blow. He realized that, despite everything, she too bore the weight of the past. "I never stopped thinking about you," Ethan confessed, feeling an urgency to be honest. "I've always wondered what happened, why we let everything slip through our fingers." Emily held his gaze for a long moment before responding. It was complicated, Ethan. Our lives were moving in such different directions. And then, Grace happened. I thought it was better that way, that there wasn't room for both of us in the same story. Her voice wavered slightly, but she maintained her composure. Ethan felt a pang at her words. Grace really was his daughter. He wanted to ask to confirm, but he was afraid of pushing too hard. Instead, he chose patience. I'd like to talk more about all of this, about us, and about Grace if you think the time is right. Emily hesitated but slowly nodded. I think we have a lot to talk about. Despite the caution in her words, there was also a sense of openness, a space for something they hadn't yet figured out how to rebuild. Their conversation continued in a careful tone, as if they were navigating uncharted waters. As they spoke, Grace approached the table, bringing a cup of tea for her mother, unaware of the emotional weight in the air. Here you go, Mom. Your usual tea. Oh, I see you've already met our most frequent customer. Grace joked lightly, not noticing the intensity of the moment. Emily smiled faintly, thanking her daughter. Yes, we've met. Ethan and I, we're old acquaintances. Her choice of words was deliberate, and her tone revealed more than she might have intended. Grace raised her eyebrows, intrigued but refrained from pressing for details. What a coincidence. Well, let me know if you need anything. She quickly returned to the counter, leaving the two alone again. Ethan seized the opportunity to continue. She's incredible, Emily. You've done an extraordinary job with Grace. His voice was sincere, almost reverent. Emily softened slightly, though her eyes still held a guarded expression. I did the best I could. It wasn't easy, but she's always been my priority. There was a brief silence, and Ethan finally felt he couldn't avoid the question that had burned in his mind since he discovered the ring. He took a deep breath before speaking. Emily, Grace is my daughter, isn't she? His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning and emotion. Emily averted her gaze for a moment, as if searching for the strength to answer. When she finally looked back at him, her eyes held a mix of sadness and acceptance. Yes, Ethan, she's your daughter. The confirmation was simple but carried the weight of unspoken history, of the difficult choices Emily had to face on her own. Ethan felt the impact of her words as though a burden had both been placed on and lifted from his shoulders. He had suspected it, but hearing the truth was something entirely different. Why didn't you ever tell me? His voice was thick with emotion, but there was no accusation in it. He didn't want to blame Emily, he only wanted to understand. Emily sighed, her gaze falling to the cup of tea in front of her. When I found out we were already apart, you were starting your career, building something big. I didn't know how it would fit into your life, and honestly, I was scared. Scared that you wouldn't want this, scared it would complicate everything even more. So, I decided it was better to leave it as it was. Ethan nodded slowly, processing her words. I would have wanted to know, Emily. I would have done anything for you and for her. His voice grew steadier, infused with a determination that seemed to reignite something inside him. Emily offered a faint smile, but sadness lingered in her eyes. I know that now, but back then, it felt impossible. The weight of the revelation hung over the table, the air between them heavy with all that had been left unsaid over the years. Ethan's mind swung between the relief of finally knowing the truth and the anguish of all the memories and moments he had missed. He wanted to ask so many things, but he felt he needed to choose his words carefully. He didn't want to make Emily retreat. Does she know? He asked at last, his voice low. Emily shook her head slowly. No. To Grace, you're just a regular customer who likes her coffee. I never told her. I never had the courage. She turned her gaze to the window, as if the view outside could provide some solace. I always thought it was best for her. You had your life and we had ours. I thought trying to merge the two might end up ruining everything. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling the depth of Emily's choice. He understood her reasons, even though they left him with a lingering ache. I can't change the past, Emily, but I can be part of her present if you'll let me. He looked at her with determination, waiting for some sign of approval. I don't want to take anything away from you or disrupt your life. I just want to know my daughter. Emily hesitated, her hands gripping her cup tightly. Ethan could see the internal battle she was fighting. Finally, she let out a long sigh and looked him straight in the eyes. Grace is everything to me, Ethan. I've protected her with all my strength for all these years. The thought of anything hurting her, of this complicating her life, it terrifies me. But at the same time, she deserves to know. I've always known this truth might come out someday. Maybe it's time. Ethan nodded, respecting Emily's cautious approach. I promise I won't do anything to hurt her or pressure her. I'll let you take the lead however you think is best. I want to be part of her life, but only if it's something she wants to. They sat in silence for a few moments, as if both needed time to process the magnitude of the conversation. The cafe around them seemed to fade into a blurry backdrop, their world narrowing to the table they shared, to this moment. Finally, Emily said, "Give me some time to figure out how to tell her. Grace is strong, but this will change everything. I'll wait as long as it takes," Ethan replied sincerely. He knew patience would be essential, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path to rebuilding something he thought was lost. The days that followed were marked by a quiet tension. Ethan continued visiting the Maple Brew but kept his conversations with Grace brief, wary of saying anything that might reveal the truth before the right moment. He knew the responsibility now lay with Emily, and each visit to the cafe became an exercise in self-control. Grace, on the other hand, seemed to sense that something was different. She remained the kind and attentive young woman she always was, but occasionally, she caught him looking at her with a distant, almost melancholic expression. Emily, meanwhile, was equally restless. She spent sleepless nights contemplating how to tell Grace that the man she served coffee to almost daily was her father. The doubts consumed her. How would Grace react? Would she feel angry for having been kept in the dark? Or would she embrace the truth willingly? It was hard to predict. Emily knew Grace was resilient, but she also knew her daughter deeply valued honesty. Finally, Emily decided she couldn't delay any longer. She chose a quiet evening after dinner to have the conversation. Grace was sitting on the couch, distracted by her phone, when Emily entered the room and sat beside her. "I need to talk to you about something important," she began, trying to keep her voice steady but feeling a lump in her throat. Grace immediately put her phone down, sensing the seriousness in her mother's tone. "Of course, Mom. What is it?" Emily took a deep breath before continuing. "Do you remember the customer who's been coming to the cafe a lot lately, Ethan?" Grace nodded, her expression curious. "Yeah, of course. He's nice. Why?" Emily paused, gathering the courage she needed. "He's not just a customer, Grace. He's your father." The words hung in the air, and Grace's face slowly shifted from surprise to something deeper, a mix of shock and disbelief. "My father," she repeated, as though she needed to hear it again to understand. Emily nodded, her eyes filled with emotion. "Yes, I never told you before because, at the time, it felt like the only option. But he's here now, and he believes it's time for you to know." Grace sat in silence for a few moments, processing the revelation. Finally, she asked, her voice unsteady, "Did he know? Did he know about me all this time?" Emily quickly shook her head. "No, he only just found out by chance. It was fate that brought him to us, and he wants to meet you, Grace. But that will only happen if it's what you want too." The room fell silent again. Grace stared at the floor as a flood of thoughts overwhelmed her. There were so many questions, so many conflicting emotions, that she didn't know how to organize them. Finally, she lifted her eyes to her mother. "I need some time to think. This is a lot." Emily nodded, respecting Grace's need for space. "I understand. I just want you to know that he seems sincere. And no matter what you decide, I'm here for you, as I've always been." Grace didn't respond immediately, but her expression softened slightly. She knew the truth she had just learned would change her life forever. But deep down, she also felt a flicker of curiosity about the man who, until now, had been nothing more than a stranger. In the days following the revelation, Grace carried a mix of emotions that seemed impossible to untangle. She continued going to work, smiling at customers, and maintaining her routine, but her mind was constantly preoccupied with her mother's words. The man she had thought was just a customer was, in fact, her father. Every interaction with Ethan now felt charged with a meaning she didn't know how to handle. She began observing him differently, trying to find pieces of herself in him. The way he spoke, the expressions he made when deep in thought, even the way he held his coffee cup. Small details that had once gone unnoticed now became subjects of constant analysis. Grace felt a growing curiosity but also a faint sense of anger. It wasn't directed at Ethan, exactly, but at the fact that the life she thought she knew had been built around an absence she never even realized existed. Ethan, on the other hand, noticed the subtle shift in Grace's behavior, though he didn't know the exact reason for it. Emily hadn't yet told him about their conversation, and he chose to give Grace space, even though the waiting made him anxious. He kept his visits to the Maple Brew brief and discreet, avoiding any interaction that might seem intrusive. Finally, on a quieter afternoon at the cafe, Grace approached Ethan's table with something more than her usual friendliness. She seemed determined, yet hesitant, as if carrying an invisible weight. "Can we talk?" she asked directly. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine but agreed immediately, motioning for her to sit. Grace placed her notepad on the counter and took a seat across from him. For a moment, she simply studied him, as though trying to figure out who he really was. "I know who you are," she began, her voice firm but not hostile. Ethan held her gaze, feeling the weight of her words. "My mom told me about you, about everything." He took a deep breath before responding, keeping his tone calm. "I thought she might. Grace, I don't even know where to start. I know this must be a shock for you, but I want you to know I'm here to answer any questions you have, or just to listen if that's what you need." Grace leaned forward, resting her arms on the table. "Why now? Why weren't you around before?" Her voice held a hint of hurt but also genuine curiosity. Ethan felt his heart tighten, but he knew he needed to be truthful. "I didn't know about you until now. If I had, I would never have stayed away. Finding you and your mother was a coincidence, but it's also an opportunity one couldn't ignore. I want to be part of your life if you'll let me." There was a weighted silence between them. Grace seemed to be carefully considering his words. Finally, she sighed and said, "I don't know how I feel yet. There's a lot to process, but I think I want to understand who you are. I don't know what that means, but maybe we can start there." Ethan nodded, relieved. "I'll take that, Grace. Whatever steps you want to take. I'll be here." Grace stood up, grabbed her notepad from the counter, and returned to work, but something felt different. For the first time, Ethan sensed an opening. It was a beginning. In the days following their conversation, Ethan and Grace began to build a delicate balance. She still kept some distance, but it was clear that something had shifted. Their conversations, once casual and focused on small talk, began to deepen. Grace occasionally asked questions about Ethan's life, and he carefully shared pieces of his story. He knew he was navigating uncertain terrain but cherished every small step forward. One Saturday, Grace surprised Ethan with an unexpected suggestion. "There's a park nearby where I usually walk on weekends. If you want, we could go there and talk more." Her tone was neutral, but the invitation felt significant. Ethan accepted without hesitation, sensing it was an opportunity to strengthen their connection. The park was quiet, with tall trees casting soft shadows over the dirt paths. Grace walked with her hands in her pockets, occasionally kicking small stones, while Ethan kept pace beside her. For a while, they were silent, listening to the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant chirping of birds. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It seemed filled with something they weren't yet ready to put into words. Finally, Grace spoke. "My mom has always been everything to me. She did the impossible to raise me, and I think part of me feels like accepting you would somehow be disloyal to her." Ethan listened carefully, respecting the honesty of her words. "I understand, Grace. Your mom is an incredible person, and everything she's done for you is admirable. I'll never try to take that away from you. I don't want to replace anything, just add to it." Grace glanced at him sideways, as if weighing his words. "Do you really believe you can be part of my life now, after all this time? Because I don't know how that works. I don't know if I want it, but I also don't know if I want to reject the idea." Her voice carried a tone of frustration but also vulnerability. Ethan stopped walking for a moment, meeting her gaze. "I don't have all the answers, Grace, but I do know this: I want to try. Not to force anything or rush you, but to be here, however you need me to be. It's your choice, and I'll respect whatever you decide." Grace nodded slowly, as if his words had offered her some measure of reassurance. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like they were walking it together. Ethan stopped walking for a moment and looked at Grace. "I don't expect this to be easy for you. I'm not here to force anything. I just want you to know that you have a father, someone who's willing to be whatever you need, in a way that works for you. No rules, no timelines, just an opportunity to get to know each other." Grace nodded slowly, seeming to accept his words. They resumed walking, and their conversation shifted to lighter topics. Grace asked about the places Ethan had visited and his memories of his youth. He, in turn, wanted to learn more about her hobbies and the dreams she had for the future. When they returned to their starting point, Grace turned to Ethan. "That was nice. I don't know what happens next, but I think I want to try to figure it out." Ethan smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't experienced in a long time. "That's more than I could have hoped for." A few weeks after their walk in the park, Grace decided she was ready to take a bigger step. She suggested that Ethan come to the house she shared with Emily for a family dinner. It was an idea that made her nervous, but she knew it was inevitable if they were to move forward. Ethan, for his part, accepted the invitation cautiously. He understood that his presence in their home would be symbolic, laden with meanings far beyond a simple meal. On the evening of the dinner, Ethan arrived with a bouquet of flowers for Emily and a small wrapped box for Grace. He didn't want to overdo it, but felt that a thoughtful gesture was appropriate. When Emily opened the door, her expression showed a mix of surprise and perhaps a touch of emotion. "Come in, Ethan," she said with a restrained smile. It was his first time stepping into their home, and the space radiated comfort and simplicity. Every detail, from the pictures on the walls to the bookshelf overflowing with books, seemed to tell a story of resilience and love. The dinner was a blend of light-hearted moments and meaningful conversations. Grace began to open up, sharing childhood stories that drew laughter from Emily and emotional smiles from Ethan. In turn, Ethan spoke about his youth and the dreams that had driven him to build everything he had, while also acknowledging the sacrifices and regrets along the way. The exchange between the three felt natural, as if, for a moment, time had erased the gaps that had kept them apart. After dinner, while Emily cleared the dishes, Grace opened the gift from Ethan. Inside the small box was a leather notebook with her initials engraved on the cover. "I thought you might use it to jot down your thoughts or plans. Something just for you," Ethan explained with a humble tone. Grace smiled, touched by the simplicity and meaning of the gesture. "Thank you. I love it." As the evening wound down, Emily suggested they sit in the living room. The space was cozy, lit only by a soft lamp in the corner. It was then that Grace did something unexpected. "I want to say something," she began, looking directly at Ethan. I still don't know what our relationship will look like moving forward, but I want to try. I want to understand who you are and give you a chance to be part of my life." Ethan's heart swelled with emotion. He met Grace's gaze, his voice steady yet filled with gratitude. "That's all I could ever ask for, Grace." "Thank you." Emily watched the exchange, a quiet smile on her lips. For the first time in years, it felt like they were all moving toward something new, something that might not erase the past but could create a future worth holding on to. Her words were heavy with emotion, and Ethan needed a moment to process them. "Grace, this means the world to me. I know I can't make up for lost time, but I promise to do everything I can to be the father you deserve." Emily, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "I'm proud of you, Grace. And, Ethan, I think the two of us have finally found a way to move forward. Maybe it's a new story, different from the one we started, but just as meaningful." As Ethan left that evening, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Genuine hope. Walking through the quiet streets of Boston, he realized that, for the first time, he was building something money couldn't buy. Something real, rooted in love, forgiveness, and time. He knew the road ahead would be long, but he also knew it would be worth it. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like and a comment. Let me know which city you're watching this video from. A big hug, and see you in the next story.